I've been fascinated by this story for a long time. You've probably heard bits and pieces before, maybe you watched a movie or read a headline. But trust me, the real experiences of the Perron family go far beyond any Hollywood dramatization. When I first looked into their story, I was struck by how ordinary they were: a mom, a dad, and 5 daughters, all hoping for a fresh start in a charming old farmhouse. And that's where everything changed for them. So let's head back to the early 1970s, to a farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, and discover how a beautiful piece of property turned into the site of one of the most notorious hauntings in American history. From the outside, it seemed like a dream come true. Roger and Carolyn Perron were looking for a place where their girls, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, could grow up surrounded by nature, free from the hustle and bustle of city life. Picture wide open fields, that comforting sense of calm you get when you step away from the noise, and an old house brimming with character. The windows were original. The floors creaked in that charming way only antique floorboards can, and the walls practically whispered stories of the past. At least, that's what they thought at first. But almost immediately after moving in, they realized that this farmhouse wasn't just old. It felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with the living. Doors would open on their own, brooms would go missing, and then turn up in places no one remembered leaving them. Clocks would stop at odd times, as if on cue. Even more unsettling were those moments when they'd walk into a room and feel like they'd interrupted someone or something. It was that strange, electric feeling that you get when you're sure you're not alone, even if you can't see anyone else there. Carolyn Perron was the first to pick up on how wrong it all felt. In the beginning, she tried to brush it off. After all, old houses have quirks. Drafts can make doors slam, faulty wiring can mess with appliances, and we've all misplaced our keys once in a while. So she told herself it was nothing. But that feeling of being watched never went away. She started sleeping less, waking up in the middle of the night feeling uneasy, and she couldn't shake the idea that the house itself was observing them, somehow. The daughters picked up on it too, but kids are resilient. They found it exciting at first to explore every nook and cranny. This house had so many rooms, tucked away closets, and hidden corners. It was like living in a storybook, and they loved the sense of adventure. But it didn't take long for even the youngest of them to realize there were things about this place they couldn't explain. The older girls tried to stay calm and protect the younger ones, reminding them that old houses make funny noises. But even they started having trouble sleeping. Before long, small incidents turned into bigger ones. Cindy, one of the middle daughters, claimed she could hear voices late at night, whispering in the walls. She'd press her ear against the wood, convinced that if she just listened carefully, she could figure out what they were saying. She never could, but the voices didn't go away. They mumbled and hissed, sometimes arguing, sometimes weeping. And those nights she stayed awake listening, the voices always seemed to get louder, as if they knew they had an audience. At first, her sisters teased her about it. Kids do that, right? They thought she was imagining things or trying to scare them. Then Christine started hearing something too, like distant murmurs coming from empty rooms. Nancy thought she saw someone walk by her bedroom door late at night, only to check and find no one there. Andrea felt taps on her shoulder when she was alone, as if someone was trying to get her attention. April would find her toys moved around or arranged in odd patterns. The family dog would bark at corners of the house, first standing on end, refusing to go near certain areas. Little by little, the realization sank in, something was off, and it was affecting all of them. Carolyn, Determined to understand what was happening, dove into the farmhouse's history. She started by talking to neighbors, flipping through old records at local archives, and piecing together bits of gossip that had circulated around the small town for generations. What she found was not reassuring. The house was centuries old. Many families had lived and died there, and not all those deaths were natural or peaceful. There were rumors of suicides, drownings, tragedies involving children, and individuals who'd gone missing under strange circumstances. Names popped up repeatedly, like echoes through time, but one name in particular seemed to cast a long, dark shadow over the place: Bathsheba Sherman. Bathsheba was said to have lived on the property in the mid-1800s. According to local lore, she'd been accused of practicing dark rituals. Some said she'd sacrificed a child, though nothing was proven in court. Still, the whispers and accusations stuck. Townspeople avoided her, claimed she was a witch, and after her death, they circulated stories that her spirit lingered, angry and vengeful, cursing the property. Carolyn found references to Bathsheba's grave, her possible ties to the farmhouse, and enough to make her blood run cold. But Carolyn tried to keep this information to herself. She didn't want to scare her children any more than they already were. She told Roger, her husband, and he tried to comfort her, insisting that there had to be a rational explanation. He didn't like the idea of ghosts, curses, or anything supernatural. It's not that he dismissed her concerns entirely, but he believed there had to be a more straightforward reason for what they were experiencing. He was a pragmatic man, focused on the day-to-day reality of keeping his family safe and fed. Ghosts weren't part of his worldview, so he tried to find mundane explanations. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore what was happening in his own home. Bruises began appearing on Carolyn's body. They were large, dark, and painful, showing up on her arms, legs, and back without any explanation. She'd go to bed feeling fine, only to wake up covered in bruises. Then there were the sharp pains at night, almost like being pricked with a large needle. She'd leap out of bed, gasping, certain that something had stabbed her, but there was never anything there. These experiences weren't just unnerving, they were physically harming her. She tried to hide the bruises from her children, but they noticed. Kids always notice when something's wrong with their parents. As the weeks turned into months, each family member had their own encounters. Andrea, the oldest, was a teenager who tried to maintain a sense of calm for her younger sisters. But she admitted later that she would lie awake in the dark, heart pounding, hearing footsteps in the hallway. The steps would start at one end of the corridor, grow louder as they came closer, then stop right outside her door. She'd hold her breath, waiting, every nerve on edge. Sometimes they'd continue on, fading into the distance. Other times, there'd be a quiet tapping on the door, just 2 or 3 knocks, then silence. She'd work up the courage to look, but no one was ever there. Nancy tried to cope by telling herself there must be logical reasons for everything they were experiencing. Maybe the wind caused the footsteps, or the old pipes were knocking. But it's hard to dismiss something that starts to seem so personal. She once woke up to the sound of someone calling her name, just once, firmly and clearly. She walked through the house, searching for who might have called her, only to find everyone else asleep. Moments like that left her feeling rattled, uncertain, and increasingly afraid. Cindy, who was younger, struggled the most at night. She'd have vivid dreams of people she didn't know, women in old-fashioned clothes, men who seemed angry, children who sobbed and moaned. She'd wake up crying, certain that those people had been standing around her bed. Christine didn't talk much about what she felt or saw, but her sisters noticed she was more withdrawn, quieter than usual. And April, the youngest, said she had a new friend, a spirit she called Rory, but no one else could see him. There was this pervasive sense of doom, like a cloud hovering over the farmhouse, refusing to blow away. Arguments broke out over the smallest things. The once close-knit Perron family started fraying at the edges. The tension, the lack of sleep, the constant fear, it wore them down. Roger and Carolyn tried to hold everything together, but the stress was immense. They worried about the girls' emotional well-being. They considered moving, but finances were tight, and they put so much into buying this house. It wasn't a simple matter to just pack up and go. They felt trapped, as though the house had claimed them, and they couldn't break free. On top of all this, there were sightings of apparitions. Strange figures glimpsed in hallways, near windows, or in the corners of rooms. Sometimes these apparitions appeared solid enough to mistake for a real person, only to vanish. Other times they were wispy, transparent shapes that flickered in the periphery of one's vision. The family grew reluctant to wander around the house alone. They clustered together in the safer-feeling spaces, leaving certain rooms untouched. They'd keep all the lights on, as if that could ward off whatever was lurking. But even bright lights didn't change the suffocating atmosphere. It still felt like something was always watching, waiting. Carolyn's research into Bathsheba Sherman continued. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that Bathsheba's spirit was haunting the house, and specifically targeting her. According to local legends, Bathsheba despised competition for attention or affection. Some versions of the story claimed Bathsheba had lost her own child under suspicious circumstances and carried a lifelong bitterness toward mothers, especially those with multiple children. Whether these stories were rooted in fact or folklore, Carolyn felt the brunt of this spirit's anger. She started having terrifying visions of a woman with a twisted, scowling face standing beside her bed, glaring at her. One night, Carolyn woke to a crushing pressure on her chest, as though someone were sitting on top of her. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. In the haze of panic, she glimpsed what looked like Bathsheba's face hovering inches from hers, eyes blazing with malice. Then, just as suddenly, the weight lifted, leaving Carolyn gasping for air. She scrambled out of bed, flipped on the light, and found nothing there, except for bruises forming on her chest. That incident left her shaken to the core. Roger wanted to call a doctor, but Carolyn insisted this was not a medical issue. How do you explain to a doctor that you believe a ghost is attacking you? The children noticed how different their mother looked. She seemed pale, constantly exhausted, and her eyes had that distant, haunted look. She tried to put on a brave face and keep up with her daily chores, but it was becoming impossible to hide her fear. Roger grew more concerned as well, but he felt helpless. He'd walk through the house at night with a flashlight, peering around corners, looking for intruders he knew logically couldn't be there. A man can't fight what he can't see, and the frustration weighed heavily on him. Word started to spread around town about the strange happenings at the old Arnold estate. Some neighbors warned the Perrons to leave. Others, more superstitious folks, hinted that they'd seen or heard odd things around that property for years. A few offered help, but mostly people just gossiped. The Perrons were stuck in a nightmare that no one else seemed eager to get involved in. Carolyn tried contacting clergy, hoping the blessing of the house would help. But the blessings didn't stop the activity. If anything, it seemed to provoke it. The presence in the house grew more aggressive, as if it resented any attempt to force it out. By this point, the daughters were each dealing with their own unsettling experiences. Andrea started a journal, writing down everything she saw or heard, hoping that somehow putting it into words would help her make sense of it all. She wrote about doors slamming, items moving on their own, and that feeling of a hand on her back when no one was there. Cindy would beg her parents to let her sleep in their room, while Christine became almost silent, speaking only when necessary. Nancy noticed the tension was wearing on everyone, but she didn't know how to fix it. April, the youngest, still talked about her invisible friend, but her cheerful tone had begun to fade. Now she mentioned things Rory would say, things that sounded far too grim and adult for a little girl to invent on her own. The family started reaching a breaking point. Carolyn couldn't handle the constant bruises and the nightly assaults. Roger couldn't stand seeing his wife and daughters so terrified. One evening, after a particularly violent encounter in which Carolyn was thrown to the floor by an unseen force, they decided they couldn't do this alone anymore. That's when they reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the now famous paranormal investigators who had built a reputation for tackling cases exactly like this. Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived one chilly afternoon, greeted by a visibly shaken Carolyn. Lorraine was a clairvoyant and a light trance medium. Ed was a demonologist. They'd investigated countless haunted houses, possessions, and supernatural phenomena. But they later stated that what they encountered at the Perron farmhouse was among the most intense experiences they'd ever had. Lorraine walked through the house, silent for the most part, occasionally closing her eyes as though tuning into something only she could feel. She described the energy as oppressive, suffocating, and almost gleeful in its hostility. They interviewed each member of the family at length. Andrea recounted her nights filled with phantom footsteps and ghostly whispers. Cindy talked about the voices in the walls, how they sometimes called out her name. Nancy described being woken up by the sound of someone breathing right next to her ear. Christine spoke only in fragments, clearly disturbed. April, young as she was, repeated stories of her invisible friend. And Carolyn, well, Carolyn shared everything, the bruises, the nighttime attacks, the visions, and her research into the house's history. Lorraine concluded that Bathsheba Sherman's spirit was indeed tied to the property and that it might be just one of multiple spirits present. She believed Bathsheba, or whatever was posing as Bathsheba, was a dominant force, feeding on fear and perhaps driven by jealousy or rage, especially toward Carolyn. The Warrens decided a seance or a spiritual intervention might be necessary to confront this entity and bring peace to the home. The Perrons, desperate for relief, agreed. The night they attempted the seance, the atmosphere felt charged, like the air before a violent thunderstorm. The family gathered in one of the larger rooms, along with Ed, Lorraine, and a few assistants. They set up recording devices, cameras, and religious items intended to offer protection. Lorraine led the group in prayers, calling on divine assistance to drive away whatever darkness resided in the house. Carolyn was asked to sit in the center of the room, as Lorraine believed that Bathsheba had fixated on her. What happened next was disturbing enough that many who were there refused to speak of it in detail. The accounts that do exist describe Carolyn's body stiffening, then convulsing, as though an invisible force had gripped her. She let out guttural cries that didn't sound human. Her chair lifted off the floor and was hurled several feet across the room, with Carolyn still in it. Andrea, who was watching from a corner, later said she was convinced her mother was going to die right in front of them. Roger jumped in to pull his wife free, while Lorraine urged everyone to remain calm. Eventually, the seance ended. Carolyn seemed to come out of her trance, disoriented, bruised, and terrified. But the damage was done. Roger, furious and frightened, ordered the Warrens to leave. He felt that the seance had made things worse, that their methods had endangered his wife. The Warrens, for their part, insisted they were only trying to help by forcing the entity to reveal itself so it could be banished. Whatever you believe, it was clear that the haunting wasn't over. Bathsheba, or the force in the house, had made its power known. In the aftermath, the Perrons had little choice but to continue living in the farmhouse. Financially, they couldn't afford to move right away. The disturbances didn't stop, but eventually, they seemed to settle into a grim pattern. Some days were calmer than others. Sometimes the spirits were content to knock on walls or move objects around. Other times, Carolyn would feel that stabbing pain in her leg or be thrown to the ground by an invisible force. The girls continued to see apparitions and hear voices, always on edge. It was a nightmare they couldn't wake up from, and it went on for nearly a decade. Finally, in the early 1980s, the Perron family managed to relocate. The day they left, they supposedly felt a tangible sense of relief, as if stepping out from under a dark cloud. But the memories, and in some cases the trauma, stayed with them. Andrea later wrote about the experiences in a series of books, detailing the family's ordeal. Over time, the story became the subject of widespread fascination. Paranormal enthusiasts debated the details, skeptics suggested alternative explanations, and pop culture turned the Perron haunting into one of the most famous cases in American paranormal lore. For the Perrons, however, this wasn't just a campfire story. It was their life, day after day, filled with fear, confusion, and an unseen adversary that seemed determined to break them. Some of them say they found moments of peace amidst the chaos, bonding together as a family in the face of the unthinkable. Others admit that the emotional scars took years to heal. Whether or not Bathsheba Sherman truly lingered in that house or if some other dark force was at play, one thing is certain: something truly harrowing happened in that farmhouse, something that changed the Perron family forever. Many years later, people still visit the old Arnold estate, hoping to catch a glimpse of something supernatural. Some claim they hear footsteps or sense a presence, while others leave convinced it's all a legend blown out of proportion. The property has changed hands a few times, with some owners acknowledging strange occurrences and others preferring not to talk about it. The debate over what really happened continues, but the Perrons' experiences have become an enduring part of paranormal history. And that's the story, folks, the chilling account of the Perron family and the farmhouse that drove them to the brink. The thing that always gets me is how they stayed for so long, enduring night after night of terror. You have to wonder what you'd do in their shoes. Would you pack up and run, even if it meant losing everything? Or would you stay, hoping you could somehow reclaim your home from the darkness that seemed to reside there? I think what makes this story so unnerving is that the Perrons were just a regular family looking for a better life. They weren't thrill seekers, they weren't looking for ghosts. They just wanted a place to call their own, a place where their daughters could grow up safe and happy. And then, piece by piece, day by day, that dream turned into a nightmare. It reminds us that we never really know what history a place holds, and sometimes we stumble into something that was best left alone. Whether you believe in ghosts, spirits, or curses, there's no denying that the Perrons experienced something profoundly unsettling. Their testimonies are consistent, filled with a level of detail and emotion that's hard to dismiss. Add in the involvement of Ed and Lorraine Warren, with their long track record of paranormal investigations, and you have a case that continues to captivate and terrify people around the world. So, what do you think? Was it really Bathsheba Sherman tormenting the Perron family, or was it another spirit entirely? Maybe it was multiple entities drawn to the home's tragic past. Or perhaps there's a more rational explanation that we just can't see. Whatever your stance, I hope this story gave you plenty to think about. I know I'll be double-checking my doors tonight, just in case. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of America's most famous hauntings. I appreciate every single one of you who sticks around to hear these stories. If you have your own paranormal encounter or a family legend you've been dying to share, let me know in the comments or send me an email. I love hearing from you, and your stories might just be featured in a future video. Until then, stay safe, sleep with one eye open, and remember, sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't see. I'll catch you all next time. Take care, and sweet dreams, if you can sleep after that. Good night, everyone.